The late afternoon sun dipped behind the hills, casting a golden haze over the sprawling fields of Elijah Carter's ranch. The land stretched for miles, an ocean of waving grass and weathered fences that had stood for generations. It wasn't just property, it was legacy. Elijah's grandfather had bought it in the 1940s, one of the few black men in Texas at the time able to secure a deed outright. Every inch of soil told a story, every creaking barn beam carried the weight of sweat and history. To Elijah, it wasn't just home, it was sacred. Before his deployment, Elijah stood at the gate one last time, breathing in the smell of hay, rain, and dust. His wife, Alicia, hugged him tight as their two little boys waved goodbye. He had promised them he'd be back soon, that the army only needed him for 6 months this time. But 6 months turned into a year, and a year into almost 2. During that time, the world back home didn't wait. It changed, and not for the better. While Elijah was serving overseas, a newly elected HOA board began making waves in the rural community. The Homeowners Association wasn't originally part of the ranching area, it was something that had formed when city developers started buying up land around his property. The newcomers didn't understand ranch life. They didn't like the smell of livestock, the early morning tractors, or the sound of Elijah's horses galloping across the open fields. To them, it wasn't neighborhood friendly. They wanted uniform lawns, strict regulations, and silence. At first, Alicia ignored their notices, simple complaints about noise and unapproved fencing. But the letters got bolder. One day, she received an envelope stamped in red, violation notice, nonconforming property maintenance. According to the HOA, her barn's paint color didn't match community standards. Another claimed their goats posed a nuisance to the adjacent properties. It didn't matter that Elijah's family had lived there long before any HOA even existed. Then came the fines. They started small, $150, then $300. Alicia called to dispute them, explaining her husband was deployed overseas, but the woman on the other end of the line cut her off. "We understand your situation," she said coldly, "but the rules apply to everyone." Months passed, and the HOA kept adding late fees, administrative charges, and legal processing costs. Before she knew it, the balance had ballooned to several $1,000s. Alicia tried to reach Elijah, but communication was limited. He was stationed in a remote area, often without signal for weeks. When she finally reached him, she broke down crying, telling him about the letters and threats. "Don't worry," Elijah had said calmly over the crackling line. "They can't touch the ranch. It's paid off. It's ours." He didn't know how wrong he was. While Elijah was still deployed, the HOA filed a quiet lien against the property. They claimed unpaid fees totaling just over $3,900. Because Alicia didn't understand the legal jargon, she never filed an objection. A few months later, without their knowledge, the HOA board approved the foreclosure and sold the entire 20-acre ranch at auction, for a fraction of its value, to one of their own members. The day Alicia found out, she thought it was a joke. A stranger showed up at her door with a folded deed and a smirk. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm the new owner. I'll give you 2 weeks to move out." She called everyone, the county office, the sheriff's department, even the base where Elijah was stationed, but no one could stop the eviction. Legally, the property had been transferred. The family was forced to leave the land Elijah's grandfather had built from nothing. She packed what little she could fit in her car, tears streaming down her face as her sons clung to her. When Elijah returned home months later, he drove straight to the ranch. What he saw made his blood run cold. The fields were fenced off, the barns bulldozed, and a giant development sign stood at the entrance, Cedar Hills Estates, luxury living coming soon. His family's history had been erased, and in its place stood a promise of profit. He went straight to the HOA office, still in his army fatigues, demanding answers. The board president, a smug man named Greg Walters, barely looked up from his desk. "It's all legal," Greg said with a shrug. "You didn't pay your dues, and we followed protocol." Elijah's jaw tightened. "I was overseas serving this country. You knew that." Greg leaned back, smirking. "With all due respect, Captain, that's not my problem." That sentence sealed his fate. Elijah left the office without another word, but the storm inside him had already started brewing. He made a few calls, to his commanding officer, to the base legal office, and finally to a federal attorney who specialized in military housing rights. Within days, an investigation was underway. The HOA had violated the Service Members Civil Relief Act (SCRA), a federal law protecting active duty personnel from civil actions like foreclosure while deployed. When the Army's legal department got involved, things escalated quickly. It turned out the HOA had not only sold Elijah's property illegally but had used deceptive paperwork to do it. The buyer, Greg Walters himself, had approved the sale under his own signature. That triggered a fraud investigation. The Army coordinated with federal marshals, and soon, subpoenas started flying. Every document, every transaction, every bank record tied to the HOA was seized. And when the extent of their misconduct came to light, dozens of improper foreclosures, forged liens, and illegal sales, the scandal exploded. Local news caught wind of the story. Deployed soldiers ranch sold by HOA, federal investigation launched. What began as a local dispute turned into a statewide reckoning. Within weeks, court orders rolled in. Not only was Elijah's ranch returned to him in full, but several board members were indicted for fraud, racketeering, and abuse of authority. Their assets were frozen, their personal properties repossessed, and the homes that had been wrongfully taken from other veterans and elderly homeowners were restored as well. The HOA dissolved under federal supervision, and the land that once represented greed and corruption was reclaimed for those who had been cheated. On the day Elijah moved his family back to the ranch, he stood once again at that same gate. The air was calm, the sun low on the horizon. His boys ran through the fields, laughing the way they had years ago. Alicia stood beside him, her hand slipping into his. "You really did it," she whispered. He looked out across the land, his land, and smiled faintly. "No," he said softly. "The Army did, because when one soldier was wronged, they all took it personally. And this time, they didn't."